Hey guys, welcome to our final round of videos for the Bible and the novel. We have spent this term looking at a lot of different biblical passages and modern novels that riff on them, thinking about how might contemporary fiction help to get rid of the fog of familiarity that so often makes stories almost inaccessible because we know them too well. How might rethinking characters and narrative structures, people's motivations, those small little details in the text help bring us to a richer understanding of who God is and what God's doing in the world. And help redeem the Bible for us as well. Help us have a new appreciation for the literary richness, the excitement, and the real power that's contained within this book that for so many of us in a class like the Bible and the novel at a place like George Fox, it's a text that we know really well. So how do we come to it in fresh ways and new ways? And today we in some ways meet our greatest challenge, and that is Mark chapters 11 through 16. It's the week after Easter. We have heard the story of the triumphal entry and the passion and the crucifixion very, very recently. We've celebrated it in our Zoom liturgies because we're all at home for coronavirus. We have thought through this in our personal devotions. We have been bombarded with it on Easter cards and children's videos if you're at home with kids like me. And so how do we come to even this story with fresh eyes? And so today we're going to delve into these final chapters of Mark. We'll talk about the triumphal entry. We'll talk about Jesus's time at the temple. We'll talk about the passion, what goes on in the garden, the crucifixion, and the really enigmatic short ending of this particular gospel and what that might mean for us, especially in light of Netflix's Messiah and some of the narrative moves that it makes as well. Today, I've got a couple of students from class, and we're joined again by Dr. Brandon Bruning, who is again very graciously giving his time to talk to us a little bit about the temple, what the temple means in Jewish context, and also just as a really fun conversation partner. So Brandon, thanks again for giving us your time to be here. And yeah, so why don't we jump into chapter 11 then, and the triumphal entry. Now, there's a lot going on in this passage that is not always apparent to us as modern readers. So let's maybe start there. Now, Jenny, you were commenting earlier when we were kind of just getting ready for this class about some of the stuff going on around the triumphal entry. So do you want to maybe start by just telling us a little bit about what you observed in this passage?
Yeah, I think that one thing that people don't necessarily notice or take away from the triumphal entry is that it's definitely putting militarism on its head and kind of saying screw you to the empire in some ways, if I can say that. And so yeah, I think coming in, he comes in the way a king would, but it's not in the way that they wanted necessarily. So there's some sort of cognitive dissonance with what Jesus is representing when he comes in within what is actually happening. And so I don't think people know he's coming in like a king, but not the kind of military brute force kind of king that they thought was going to come and save them and bring them independence and be the new Maccabees in some way.
Yeah. Yeah, so we've got to sort of, there's different ways we can take that, right? And we have to then think about the tone of Mark's gospel. Is it, okay, it's a flipping on the head of messianic expectations, of kingly expectations. It's also a flipping on the head of the cult of imperial Rome.
Right.
Right, because historically during Passover, Caesar's troops would come in and have a sort of parade in the city, celebrating their power, reminding the people of Rome's glory. I heard someone recently put it that they trying to squash any thoughts about any sort of rebellion or new liberation during Passover. And so one of the questions we want to ask is this a sort of is it just a part of the messianic secret? You were expecting a Davidic king, but look, it's a lowly suffering servant. Or is it also parody? And I guess that's what I'm wondering is there some parody going on in a parody of the imperial cult and a parody of Rome happening in this passage? What do you guys think?
I would say yes, and I would say it almost mirrors in some sense a prophetic action of taking this one thing and kind of dissing it or making fun of it or making it I don't want to say profane, but not making it as high as they wanted it to be. Mm-hmm. And so yeah, that would upset a lot of people if they saw he's making fun of our parades.
Yeah, I guess what I'm wanting to push at is who's the they?
Oh.
Right, who's this sinned up, or who's the parody against, and who is the inside audience who gets the irony of what's happening? And I don't think that I think that it's doing multiple things on multiple levels probably, but I'm interested in like the comedic elements of Mark in particular, especially like we talked about it a bit in our last video as well, like that there seems to be, you know, some really funny moments. I think Mark's the funniest of the Gospels. So I'm interested in like, who's the they, who's the parody against, do we think? Any thoughts?
I would say against both like Rome and against like any sort of like messianic expectation at the time. So I think it's doing both, that it's against Roman imperial like oppression, and it's making a mockery of that. And I think it's also making a mockery of that it would be some sort of like power structure, power system that would then overthrow that and like dismantle it. That I think it's making fun of power in some sense.
Okay, like all human attempts at power?
Maybe, yeah.
Let's take a look at the actual passage really closely here. So verses 1 through 11 in chapter 11. And I'm reading from the NIV because it's what I have on hand. I have others on the shelf, but as they approached Jerusalem and came to Bethphage and Bethany at the Mount of Olives, Jesus sent 2 of his disciples, saying to them, "Go to the village ahead of you, and just as you enter it, you will find a colt tied there, which no one has ever ridden. Untie it and bring it here. If anyone asks you, why are you doing this? Say, the Lord needs it, and will send it back shortly." They went and found a colt outside in the street, tied in a doorway. As they untied it, some people standing there asked, "What are you doing untying that colt?" They answered as Jesus told them to, and the people let them go. When they brought the colt to Jesus and threw their cloaks over it, he sat on it. Many people spread their cloaks on the road, while others spread branches they had cut in the fields. Those who went ahead and those who followed shouted, "Hosanna! Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Blessed is the coming kingdom of our father David. Hosanna in the highest." Jesus entered Jerusalem and went into the temple courts. He looked around at everything, but since it was already late, he went out to Bethany with the 12. So, sorry, where's my coffee? Oh, there we go. Oops. For all those of you at home watching, that's like a really typical moment in class where I will suddenly like accidentally throw a pen across the room as I gesture with my hand. So just a little, you know, normal Jessica. All right, so what did you notice as we read that? What jumped out at you? I mean, there's a few really funny and odd things happening there.
I thought it was funny that like Jesus told them what to say if anyone questioned them, and it worked. Because like he says, the Lord needs it and will send it back shortly. Like that sounds really funny. Just, I mean, in today's context, definitely, but I'm sure it was kind of funny in their context as well. But also another thing I noticed that I mentioned earlier was that no one had ever ridden this donkey before, and maybe what that symbolizes, because obviously Jesus, no one had ever done what he did before. And he was, there wasn't like another Messiah, like the show that we watched, but I don't know. I didn't know if you guys had any thoughts about that, but.
Cassie, have you ever tried to ride a colt that has never been ridden before?
Sorry, wait, who?
Have you ever tried riding a colt that's never been ridden before? Or any animal that's never been ridden before?
No, that's a good point.
Jess, Ziva's a really big dog. Do the kids ever tried riding Ziva?
Yes, and we trained her very well as a puppy, so she looks at us with this look like, seriously guys, I am not a horse, but she's very good. We broke her spirit at 7 weeks.
Okay. Most of the time an animal that hasn't been ridden before is not going to tolerate somebody sitting on it. Right. The fact that you can take this unbroken colt and have Jesus just sort of like, all right, throw some coats on, I'm getting on and riding into Jerusalem with everybody watching, by the way, right? Again, it's sort of like, you know, maybe one of those things where, you know, it's maybe not quite as impressive as calming the storm on the sea when they're like, wow, who is this that even the wind and the waves obey? But who is this that even an unbroken colt will let him ride on it is probably as you know, part of that same big deal, I think.
Yeah.
I don't know. I think that's one thing there. In addition to the imperial pageantry idea and the reference, the very explicit self-reference to the prophecy in Zechariah. But
yeah, no, I think that's a good point. The power being exercised in that, and the sense of pageantry being established right there, right? Because you can, I mean, again, I always think about these things like, how would you shoot it in a movie, right? Or what would this look like cinemagraphically? And I mean, you can imagine that not everyone in the crowd, like some of the people in the crowd are super like excited about what they see Jesus doing. But as I think you get, and this is where Messiah is really helpful, right? Not everyone who's there in the crowd believes everything that's going on. Some people are just waiting to see what happens, right? And so this is that moment too, where probably some people in the crowd are sitting there just like waiting, like, this is going to be good. Like, watch that thing. It's going to buck him off. It's going to be hysterical, right? You're expecting. So there's probably a bit of that sort of like excitement and energy and like what's really going to happen here. I'm imagining teenage boys for some reason standing there just waiting.
One thing that I find kind of funny is that it says just like some people standing there. So it's not necessarily even the owners of like the cult that are like, hey, like, what are you doing with that? So could you imagine like if you are an owner of this cult, you go to the street like leading into like Jerusalem, you're like, wait, that's my donkey. And Jesus riding, like he just took it, like did no one stopped them from like doing it. Like I find that kind of odd. It's not, and the owners of the cult ask like, oh, what are you doing? It's just some people, and then they confirm like, oh, we'll bring it back.
Like, okay, cool.
Like somebody sitting there breaking into your car, hot wiring, and it's okay, the Lord needs it, I'll bring it right back.
Right.
Oh, fine, just go take it.
And strangers just let them take it, and then you see the car going down the street, and you're like, well, that's mine.
one of the things that is really difficult for translators is getting the nuance of this. And the word Lord is kurios in Greek. And of course, this conversation is happening among people who probably aren't speaking Greek, but in the story that we have it is in Greek, and kurios is not just Lord, but master. And so it can mean owner, right? And so it probably is playing with a double meaning, and the same thing happens actually in Hebrew when you say, you know, somebody is Baal of this,
right?
Is the Lord of something, or the master of something, the owner of something. It's a lot more flexible than our sort of very specific.
For sure, yeah.
Yeah.
So, I mean, you know, it could be that, you know, here's a way for you to craftily get what you want, right? By letting people hear what they want.
Yeah.
Right? And then saying, yeah.
Although, okay, like, and I totally, yeah, you follow that argument and think that's right, except it still raises questions about, like, who are these people standing around when some total random stranger comes up and says, oh yeah, the owner needs it.
Don't they know who the owner is? Their neighbor. Yeah.
Yeah.
Of course, it is Jerusalem a few days before Passover, and right, well, it's a suburb of Jerusalem, but you know, everybody is, as you mentioned, flooding into the city.
Right. So, and even
a lot of strangers.
So shouldn't you be more vigilant under that?
Right.
Random people coming along claiming that the owner needs the donkey?
Probably a lot of random donkeys too.
Okay.
Bring stuff. I don't know.
Right. But then why question it at all? Why put your nose in somebody else's business at all if you don't think that there's something fishy going on?
Because you go into the village. Anybody lived in a small town? Everybody's in everybody's business. I don't know.
But then that brings up the question. So you're in everybody's business, so you just trust this random person you've never seen before. There seems to be something weird happening here socially.
There could be, like, you know, I could also see it being that these neighbors were like, oh, someone is maybe taking my neighbor's donkey. I'm going to ask him just like to like make myself feel like I did something. And then they said something like kind of legit, but not super legit or anything. And then the neighbors are like, okay, sounds good. As long as you bring it back. Or like, it also could be like not necessarily trust, but just like I did what I was supposed to do kind of. I put like another measure of safety on my neighbor's belongings, but not that much. So.
Okay.
Or at least covered my own culpability, right?
Yeah, exactly. They said they'd bring it back. Like, yeah.
And they did. So it all worked out okay in the end.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I was looking to see if they actually did, but I guess it's implied when they go back out that evening.
I'm sure, yeah.
I'm going to go with Jesus didn't steal the colt that he promised to return.
Well, Jesus didn't. He had other people do it for him. So he's also free of any of that.
So if the disciples kept it, it's all okay.
Right.
I'm still going with the disciples returned it. I think that's probably, probably what happened. But I mean, yeah, you're right. It actually doesn't say that they ever did return the cult. So I just want to go back to my Ocean's 11 suggestion from the calling of the disciples, because this feels like another one of those narrative moments where like there is something kind of weird happening, and and it just seems to make sense to me in terms of the sort of the heist film, right? Like trying to make something happen that just feels a little fishy, but it works out okay in the end.
The great donkey heist.
The great donkey heist. Yeah. But why? I mean, is it just about the humor? And it could be like, maybe we just have forgotten that all of this is there is a deep humor in it, in that deep like historical literary sense, right? That this is a great comedy. It looks like a great tragedy, but really this is a great comedy where the world is turned upside down. The master is the servant of everyone. The servant is elevated. You know, the carpenter from Galilee is elevated. The everything we think we know about power and about all of that is turned on its head in that classic way that comedy works. And although the ending appears to be a tragedy, maybe the humor, maybe the parody is here to help call us back to these big genre things of like, no, this is going to be a comedy, guys. This is going to end with a wedding somewhere very far down the road.
There's another thing about this passage that picks up on something that Mark doesn't include very often in the previous scene. You all just sort of noticed that all of the northern chapters, right? Everything in Galilee and in across the sea in Gerasa and over to the northwest in Tyre, but all of that northern stuff like moves down the Jordan Valley to Jericho and then over into Jerusalem. And so the last thing that we have before the Jerusalem chapter is as going through Jericho, Bartimaeus calls out, Jesus, son of David, have mercy on me. And the crowds are like, shush. And he keeps calling out, son of David, have mercy on me. And so finally, right, Jesus gives him some attention, right, and heals him. But he doesn't do it because Bartimaeus calls him son of David. And here we have the crowds inserting this one thing in what would be a very familiar text to many people in the audience from Psalm 118, right? The Psalms of praise, the Hallel songs, the Hallel songs. This one line that isn't there. Blessed be the coming kingdom of our ancestor David. So flipping those two things, or setting those two things sort of side by side, the last thing before you get into Jerusalem and the first thing upon arriving into Jerusalem, sets up this tension for how to understand the Messiah as son of David or not. And that pops up a couple more times in the Jerusalem chapters.
Yeah.
A thoughtful glance to the side. Was there something?
Oh, no, I was just thinking.
I was just watching the kids. Okay.
So, yeah. Yeah, no, I think that's a really interesting question. Let's take a minute to think about that, and we will come back in a few minutes with some answers.